So in a lot of the world, water's stored naturally through snowpack. Pacific Northwest in the US and Canada, for example, is a great example. The Columbia Basin, huge basin, international basin, where the climate models are telling us that more of that water that falls is going to fall as rain and not as snow. This means that the institutions that we've built, the Columbia River Treaty, for example, the dams that we manage collectively between the US and Canada are managed for a certain hydrologic regime. Now all of a sudden we're seeing more waterfall as rain. That means it's falling earlier. It means we don't necessarily have the storage capacity to store it. This brings up for the first time in 50 years the question of new dams in the Pacific Northwest. And we know from our research around the world that dams without dams that are built unilaterally often by themselves can be a cause of tension. So we see this in the Pacific Northwest while we're starting to think about the Columbia River Treaty starting to has to be re-examined, and we see this in other places around the world. Columbia River Treaty is a really interesting case of a transboundary water basin in flux, where the treaty itself carries through 2024, but either side can ask for renegotiations for different components of it starting 10 years earlier, which brings us to 2014, which isn't so far away. That's leading to really exciting new conversations in the region as a whole, and Oregon State University has been working with other universities around to help host dialogues, basin-wide dialogues around the issues that are coming up. Essentially, the treaty negotiated two sets of benefits, hydropower and flood control, and they did that very, very well. And it's one of the first treaties that got us away from allocating water and started talking about how do you allocate benefits. They did that explicitly. Well, in the last 50 years, a lot of things have changed. Tribal rights were absolutely ignored in the first round, and the tribes have developed a lot more political clout than they had and legal clout than they had at the time. Awareness of the ecosystem, and particularly migratory fish, has become much more important, and the insistence on public participation has grown in the last 50 years. So the question now is, when you have a treaty that's fairly static, how do you incorporate these changes that have come up? And it's leading to very exciting dialogues where First Nations in Canada have been meeting sometimes for the first time with the tribes in the U.S. to talk about the things that they share in common, the desire particularly to bring a lot of the migratory fish back into regions where they haven't been for years. It's getting environmentalists and dam operators into the same room to talk to each other. And there's this kind of specter hovering over us of climate change, which is changing the hydrologic regime. While we're having these conversations, is adding a certain amount of urgency to the conversation.